Hello and welcome to the Life Together podcast, where we share in meaningful conversation about living for Christ and loving one another. Thanks for joining today, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, I'm here today with Bill Sanchez, and Bill's been with us for this teen weekend, and all the kids, I just feel like you're just like this magnetic factor. Like people enjoy so much being around you, and your passion and excitement in the Lord just rubs off. And so I'm really glad that you got to be here this year and that all the kids got to be a part of this, but also your family, having them here this year with Heather and Lucas and Matthias. We're just so grateful for all of that and the work that you put into this weekend. So thank you for coming, first of all.
Honestly, thank you for having me. I maybe there's a magnetic effect. Again, like I said this morning, because I'm still young. You keep putting me up with 50-year-olds. I feel especially young. Keith, I hope you don't hear this. Keith, I hope you don't hear this later on. No, it was great. The kids are great. And honestly, you know, when kids have a desire to be with each other and they're engaged, it's so much easier to make that connection. There's kids sometimes places where you do these sorts of things and that connection isn't there. And that's not a knock on those kids, but there's a buy-in here from the kids. There's a buy-in to the weekend. There's a buy-in from the parents, from everybody that helps out. And that makes it so much easier to come in and just play your role, because you're like everybody else has played their role and they're playing it super well, and you want to be a part of that. You don't want to be the person that drops the baton. But no, man, the weekend was so great, and just seeing those kids just want to be with each other, want to be in the Word, asking questions afterwards is super encouraging. Yeah.
Well, you're right. Definitely a huge team effort, but I especially appreciate the part that you and Keith played in it. And I didn't really think about this when we were planning the weekend, but you and Keith both come from families where you didn't grow up in the church. You didn't have a Christian background. As you remind me and others, you didn't go to FC.
That's correct. I did not. You can still make it to heaven, by the way.
That's right. So, but all that to say, you had, I don't know how you would describe your own upbringing, what words you would use, but you didn't grow up in the church. You didn't have that background.
Yeah.
How did you come to the faith? Who led you to know Jesus?
Yeah. So truly, it was really the providence of God. When I think about that, I think that's a word that people are uncomfortable about, talking about God working in people's lives. Now, it's easier to look back and say this was the providence of God than to look at the moment, look at a moment and say this is God actively working in my life. But we know that God works in our lives. And it's funny, I think about how God made everything work out in my life, in the ways in which He did. And there wasn't, like, the preacher played, honestly, the smallest role in my conversion. And I think one of the things that when I think about my life and I think about maybe me coming to the Lord and I think about and then which it plays a role in maybe how I think about evangelism and how I try to evangelize, is that it's a we were talking about this now, we mentioned it this morning, it's a team effort. And it's a lot of people just playing their role, maybe in ways in which they don't even realize that this is going to affect people and help people come to the Lord. But that's honestly what happened. And so it actually started with, maybe take it back a step, just a little bit of background, So I'm one of 28 kids. My father had 28 children with 8 different women. He did witchcraft and sorcery and black magic for a living. Like that's the environment I grew up in. And so like at home, I grew up in Manhattan and Harlem and, the early mid 90s and like violent, rough area, drug dealers across the street, things like that. Like I didn't grow up in the safest environment. And then in our apartment, it was 8 of us in a 2-bedroom apartment, and like people anytime and every time just coming in. And by no stretch were we, impoverished. Truly, like we weren't impoverished. We didn't struggle, anything like that. But it was when you grew up in New York and you're one of that many kids and you grew up in that sort of environment, it's kind of like do whatever you want, no one cares, nothing matters, is the environment I honestly grew up in. And in some ways, even that played a role in my coming to the Lord and facilitated me coming to God. But that's kind of where I grew up in. And like the first person really that when I think about maybe me coming to Jesus and all the people that played a role in it, the first person played a role without even knowing she was realizing she was playing a role at the time. She's passed away now. A 75-year-old lady is the reason I tell people I'm a Christian today.
That's awesome.
And all she did was go to church. And so there was this lady named Ida, and she lived a few blocks away from where I grew up, a tenth of a mile to use Southern speak for distance there. But she grew up a few blocks away from me. And, you know, she because of her age, she had some health issues. She had a home attendant, a caretaker that had to come and take care of her every day. Like, this is Monday through Sunday, state regulated, whole thing. And and usually those ladies had multiple caretakers that would come and do that. Well, there was a lady who is not my aunt, but by association, in a lot of ways, she helped raise me. So again, with that many kids, you end up needing help from people in the community. It takes a village and that sort of thing. But there was a lady who I view as an aunt to my kids. She's grandma today, but she wasn't a Christian. This is early 2000s, was taking care of this lady. And so just to kind of the people here, right? So it's a 75-year-old lady who's just going to church. Her name is Ida. And then it's my aunt, quote unquote, who we call her Tia Niña, Aunt Little Lady, or Little Girl. But Tia Niña was in charge of taking care of Ida, which meant if on Sunday Ida chose to go to church, Tia Niña had to go. And she had to just sit with her to make sure that she was okay. Wow. If on Tuesday nights, and up there, it was a Spanish-speaking church at the time, Tuesdays and Thursday nights, they had Bible class. If Ida wanted to go to Bible class, Tia Niña had to go. And so you think about it, and we're talking New York, where in the wintertime it's cold. It's all the reasons. This lady had asthma. She had all the reasons where she could just say, I'm not feeling it today. I'm going to stay home. She just made the effort. She went. And because she went, as often as she went and made the commitment to go, Ida wasn't perfect, but my aunt heard the gospel that way. And it wasn't just her, but in fact, there was almost like, it felt like a little scheme of like these older ladies in New York where they'd have caretakers and they would bring their caretakers to church with them. So the caretakers are getting paid to hear about Jesus. It's like, it's such a bizarre scenario.
The movers and shakers of New York City.
That's
are
right.
These
That's how
women.
That's right.
That's cool.
But that's kind of what made, like, that was the catalyst to a lot of that. And so my aunt hears the gospel, and at first I'm ecstatic, not because I care about Jesus, but because she's gone every Tuesday and Thursday night. So my cousin, her son, and I would play video games, so it was great. But eventually, she again, I didn't go to FC, and I'm not going to knock FC, but it was, so eventually she hears of the Florida college camp in the Northeast, and she's telling me like, oh, this camp, and I'm like, absolutely not. At this point, I'm going into high school. I'm like, I'm not going to a Christian camp. You're out of your mind, And so I was like, no, I'm not going. But she paid for me. And my parents, though they are not spiritual, what they are is principled. And so if someone pays for you, you're going to go. And so I was, kind of forced to go to camp that first year. And so again, and it's so funny, like they're one of the counselors is this girl who I now worship with. And like that first Sunday, first time I ever went to church, Gardner was preaching. I'll never forget this because I thought it was the bizarrest story in the world, But he's preaching from John chapter 9, where Jesus heals the blind man. And I'm like, blind people getting that? This doesn't happen. Like, again, I'd never opened up a Bible in my life. And so he says, go to John 9. Well, I don't know where John is in the Bible. And so I'm like flipping around trying to find it. And this girl who I now worship with, sweet lady, she's like, well, do you need help? I was like, no, I know what I'm doing. But I had no idea what I was doing, But that was just even that, like the concept of Christians wanting to help was something that was so bizarre to me, because that just wasn't really what I personally grew up with in my bubble, in my sphere, in the world, like what the world was to me. Mm-hmm. And so I get to this camp and I see these Christians, and I'm like these people are on drugs, None of this is real. I see you smiling. I know you don't mean it. I see you smiling. I see you telling me that you care about me. That's not real. Because again, in the world that I grew up in, people that age don't care about people younger than them. They don't care. Like, you get what I'm saying? And it's just, it's one of those things where, so it's funny for me, like these young people weekends, they matter so much to me because I was 14, 15, not knowing anything about Jesus, and someone took a chance with me, And so to see that they had no idea what was going to come of it. And so, so I'm 14, and my counselor is this 19-year-old college kid named Roger Polanco, who now preaches up. He was 19 at the time, and he was my counselor, and like he was a junior in college. And so that's like so to me, like it goes a 75-year-old lady who was just a Christian, a lady who was not my aunt, but just loved on me, and a college student are the reasons I'm a Christian. you know? And so Gardner, the preacher, kind of helped facilitate all those things. Gardner gave rides, and he was running the camp and all of that. But it was really Roger, this 19, 20-year-old kid, who taught me the gospel when I was 14, 15. And so we would meet. Sorry, we did the camp thing, and the camp was great, whatever. At the end of the week, I was like, this was strange, but that's fine, that's great. And he went back to FC, and I'm in high school in New York, and he would call me once a month.
Wow.
Just to check in on me. It wasn't anything crazy. Hey, how you doing? Hey. And I'm not going to lie to you, Jared, after like the third or fourth month, I was like, all right, man, level with me. What's going on? And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, and again, I was like, are you a homosexual? I used more colorful words than that. Again, I was 15, I wasn't a Christian. He's cracking up. He's cracking up. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, why are you calling me every month to ask me how I'm doing? And he was like, because I care about you. And like, it was such a strange, bizarre concept. But honestly, it was people just cared. And that was so bizarre to me. And so then you combine that with, again, the environment that I grew up in was very spiritual. People felt a lot of spirituality, but it had no basis. It had no truth. And so you combine that with, then he and I are studying the Bible, and it's like, well, look at what the scriptures say. Well, he was very big on, well, just read it. What does it say? Well, just read it. What does it say? Well, just read it. What does it say? And so it never felt like he was just trying to, he was trying to fill me with whatever agenda he had. It was like, well, no, this is what the scriptures say. And so that following year, I wasn't going to go to camp. And again, like you talk about the things that happened in life that I thank God for. I was playing varsity baseball my freshman year of high school. That summer, I was going to go to a baseball camp. And so, I didn't have time to camp. It was nice. The Christians were nice, but like that wasn't really my world. And so, whatever. The week before the camp starts, I'm playing basketball with some friends in New York, again, outside. We don't really have indoor gyms, but it had been raining earlier that day. And I went up to dunk, and I grabbed the rim, and I slipped off. And as I slipped off to block my fall, I put my hands kind of in front of my chest. I like shattered my wrist. And I thank God for it. It's one of the best things that happened to me. Yeah, wow. At the time, you don't think that. At the time, you're like, your hand is the size of a ball. You have all the things that need to happen. But if that doesn't happen, I don't go. So I couldn't go to baseball camp. It's my right wrist. I'm right-handed. And so I just was like, well, I might as well go to Jersey camp. And so I went back to that camp, and then my whole summer was open. And so because of that, Roger had just moved up to the city, and he was like, hey, I'm free if you want to, it's like, I'm going to teach a Bible study if you just want to hang out. And I was like, sure. Again, this is a college-age kid asking a high school kid, do you want to hang out with me while I go teach a Bible study? Again, I mentioned that my family life was very loose in that I could go and do whatever I wanted. Like there was very little checking in. Like I now have kids. I would never let this be real with my kids. But like there were times, like I went to Indiana, I went to New Jersey, I went to Alabama. I just went to random places with Roger. Went to Georgia. My parents had no idea where I was. I thank God that I was studying the scriptures with people. But that was my summer. Was just going place. I went from like zero Bible ever in my life to like the following year, Roger was studying with 3, 4, 5 people a day, and I was just tagging along. And so it was like a summer of like intense Bible study all the time, every day, all the time, every day. And the end of that summer, I'm convinced. And at that point, it wasn't like, honestly, people's care is what attracted me, but it was God's word that cemented me. And I was like, no, this is just true, regardless of how these people have treated me. What I'm seeing in this book is absolutely true. And so I remember I talked to my father, I'm 15, that's not true, I'm 16, talked to my dad about like, hey, this is a decision I think I'm going to make. And he let me have it, absolutely let me have it. And so like the day that I was going to go get baptized, I was like, I didn't do it. And then I remember 2 days later telling myself, what am I doing? It's like, I know for a fact that what he does is false. It's like, and I'm completely convinced that this is true, and I need to do this, regardless of what repercussions come at home. I need to do this. And there were some things at home that were difficult the first few years. I probably didn't make it better. Again, new Christian.
How old were you?
So 16.
16.
So
okay.
New Christian, immature. There's a lot that I don't understand, and a lot that I'm not doing well. And so I probably, shot myself in the foot multiple times and things like that. But again, God's grace. I even think God, just the people that he put in my life, the people that helped me and protected me and all of that spiritually, played such a role in me being where I'm at today.
Wow. That's amazing. So I've heard bits and pieces. I think maybe like the first time we met, you shared a little bit of your background. So this is just cool for me to kind of hear all of it laid out, and I know that's probably still a plain overview. Like you could
Sure.
probably go so much deeper.
Of course.
But there are a couple of things that I'm curious about. You use the word spirituality in there, and you use that to kind of describe what your dad was doing.
Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is how did you, at what point did you come to see that spirituality, however you would describe it,
Sure.
to be wrong, false, or maybe dangerous, however you would put that? And then how did you come to see the gospel of Jesus Christ as the true spirituality, the spirituality that comes from the Spirit,
Yeah.
and that brings life? What was that like, the
Yeah.
tension there?
So it was an absolute, like, so with my dad, and he's passed away now, and even, and I'll say this, maybe like, so he passed away of pancreatic cancer about 8 years ago. And the last conversation I had with him was a conversation that he, it's kind of the dad who says, here's the story, like, here's the reality. And it's like, Dad, I've known this almost my whole life, So end of his life, he says, I never believed in the witchcraft. It was just a means by which I could receive funds and sleep with women. But I never thought any of it was true. And I told him, I knew that all along. Anyone who knew you knew that. And there was just a facade. And so yesterday, even yesterday, we were talking to the kids a little bit, talk about just transparent Christianity. And I started looking at the Pharisees. And the very first point I made in Matthew 23 is that as Jesus looked at the Pharisees, one of the things he observed with them is that they say some things and they do completely opposite things, but you look at the person of Jesus and everything he says, you look at the person of God, everything God calls us to do, he does himself. God never calls us to do something he's unwilling to do. And I would just read the scriptures and it's just all over the scriptures. God is saying, be holy, but it's be holy because I'm holy. It's love. Like, we love because he first loved us. Forgive people as God has forgiven you. That's one of the things you see about God is God. 1 John 1, I'm not going to get preachy here, but just indulge me for 30 seconds here. But in 1 John 1, John writes, it says, like starting in verse 5, that God is light and in him there's no darkness. And the statement on its own, it's redundant. If God is light, obviously there is no darkness. But I think John's point is because God's character is light, in his actions you will never find darkness. And so one of the things that you see that we want to oftentimes like separate character from actions. God is like, your character is shown through your actions. And with my dad, so this is what I was saying with the spirituality, there's a lot of spiritual things. If you want to be blessed, if you want to curse people, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to live. These are the things you have. He did none of that, and you could, and as kids, we saw that, and we saw right through so much of that. And so there was this kind of huge, like, and I'm a big believer, like Romans chapter 1, if you want, because, you would not believe the number of people, and I don't mean this in third world countries, where in the United States, the number of people who buy into, that spirituality, and even this, I guess, people do that today with like zodiac signs and stuff like that, where like they think that the stars are telling them how to live their lives and how they should feel in this and that. And I'm a big believer that, again, in Romans 1, if you want to believe a lie, God will allow you. And so he made far more money than you can imagine because people just deeply believed the lie and not the truth. And so I always knew that like that was just a fictitious thing that he did. Yeah. And so
I'm curious, did he believe that lie himself? Like, did he come to convince himself that like I'm doing this and I genuinely believe it, or did it seem like it was always that?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I think for him it was always the latter. And I have family, some of his I have half siblings, who I think believe the lie and still unfortunately believe the lie. But I think for him, he always knew that it was just a means. He was a shrewd man, Yeah. It was just a means by which he was going to receive some sort of commerce, is how he viewed it. Mm-hmm. And I think he always viewed it like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I hear in that is once you came, basically you were judging the tree by its fruit. Mm-hmm. And what you found in the fruit of the spirituality that your father was engaging in was bearing bad fruit, but in inconsistent fruit. Like It did not match what was being taught, but then something about Jesus, in the way that Jesus reveals the Father showed a consistent nature that stood out to you.
Yeah, and you know, and it's like truthfully unfair, obviously, to compare anyone and say like, well, look at Jesus.
Course.
But even God's people, even people who sought to live like Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so I mentioned again the people that played a role. Like, so then Gardner Hall played a huge role to me, not so much in the things that he ever taught, though he taught me a number of things, but his person, his you know, he and my dad were about the same age. My dad would have been a little bit older than him, but just his personality, the way he treated people, his humility, his kindness. And I always just, Romans 12, he talks about all the different gifts, and he says, to him who leads. And that's how I always thought about, like, though Gardner's an evangelist, Gardner really, he just leads with his life. And that always just shines to see that sort of thing. And so I was always just appreciative of that. And so, but that was kind of coming out. And so you have all these different challenges and different things you're working through. And stuff even at home, with your siblings and your cousins, and they're like, well, what are you doing with your life? Why are you doing that? Why are you living like this? And family engagements where things like, why don't you drink? It's like, first of all, I'm 17, so that's illegal, and second of all, this is wrong. It's just, but that was the environment, like older siblings trying to do that. And so it got to a point where I actually, for the holidays, would spend time with different Christians, like around the country. Like I spent one Christmas with a family, one of our elders now in Georgia, time I wasn't even living here, but spent a Christmas with them. I spent a Christmas with Roger's family. For the New Year's, I'd go and go to Indiana for these Bible studies that Gary Fisher used to teach. And the reason why is because I needed to get away from that environment at the end of the year with my family. And it was really funny. One year, one of my older sisters, she's like, so are you going to spend the holidays with us or with your real family? And she was kind of saying it tongue in cheek, but like him, it's like, no, yeah, these actually are. This is my real family, because the people love to say like blood is thicker than water, and they have no idea what the phrase actually means. It's the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, and that's like I've seen that to be so true in my life. That the blood of the covenant that we have in Jesus Christ, that blood is so much thicker, so much more valuable, and so much more important for me than the relationships that I have with people who have been born, maybe even from the same womb as me.
Man, that's amazing. So it's the character of God mediated through other people,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing that consistent over time. Not that those people were perfect, but there was a transparency and an
Mm-hmm.
authenticity to their life that didn't match what you saw
In the lives of anybody else around me, honestly.
Yeah. Wow. So, man, so many questions come to mind. I'm curious. What about you mentioned how the first time that you showed up to, I can't remember if you said it was a church or Bible camp. You're reading John 9.
Yeah, to church was
Okay.
was the Sunday of camp.
Okay, gotcha. So the Sunday leading into camp, or Sunday at camp,
Yeah, the Sunday where camp started.
John 9, weird, bizarre story about the blind man. At what point did maybe the light bulb come on, or that subtle change occur where you're like, maybe there's something to this? Can you think of a moment where, or how that came about, how you came to believe in the scriptures?
And so really the teachings of Jesus and the epistles in the New Testament were at first for me like far more impactful than the stories were, because I could see the teachings and I could see things like, where he'll say, if you've been born again and live this transformed life, but if you've been born again, I'm thinking maybe end of Ephesians 4, but if you've been born again to like, let him who steals no longer steal, but rather work so that he may have something to give. And like, let no unwholesome word be found in your mouth. And I'm just thinking like, people who live like this, people who live following God, live legitimately more peaceful and more joyous and more loving lives than people who don't. And it was just like, it was almost like, so I studied mathematics in school. So my brain is like, it's just binary. It's I think more black and white than I'd like to tell myself that I do, but I just do. And I could like read those epistles and say, man, look at people who live this way. Look at how your life is. And people who live this way, look at how your life is. I obviously would rather live my life serving God. Yeah, it's harder, but this life clearly leads to better things than living life like this. Because I've experienced the brokenness. I've been hurt by the brokenness. And so I get that. And I've been a part of the brokenness, and so like, I'd much rather live my life like this. And just seeing some of those teachings, things that God was saying, you should live your life like this. I remember at first, like, so it was Roger and another guy named Tim Bunting. I was like, you don't have to convince me that this is how you should live life. As I read it, I'm like, yeah, this makes sense, And so it was a lot of that. And then from that, I was like, okay, well, if this God knows all these things, then surely he can do anything he wants to do if he's God. And so then some of those stories started to make more sense, and you kind of start to see even lessons in God's character and God's nature in some of those stories as well.
Yeah. Wow. So that makes a lot of sense. This might be getting a little bit ahead in the story.
Yeah.
But I know that you study with a lot of people, and over, I don't know how many years you've been preaching now, but I'm sure there's got to be dozens and dozens of studies that you've done with people. Have you found that to be a pretty common entry point where people are like, hey, I don't know if I believe all these stories.
Yeah.
All this stuff's like kind of whack. But when I hear the wisdom that is from above, we're doing the James series right now, talking about the wisdom from above versus the wisdom from below, and seeing that contrast, that, okay, this is an otherworldly wisdom. Has that been a common draw for people?
So it's so funny. You're like the third person in the last few weeks who's asked me a question like this. So when I reach out to people, or I'm studying with people at first, I'm a big believer, like, start with people where they are. I don't have like a workbook or like, here's set lessons that I'm going to do with you. If you're in Maine and you need directions to Kentucky, those directions are very different than if you're in Seattle. The destination is the same, but we can't start giving you with the same directions. But usually if someone I'm studying with knows very little about the Bible, I study the book of Ecclesiastes with them. Mm-hmm. Now I'll do like an abridged version. We'll try to go a little bit faster. But what I try to do, because people in the world know that the life that they lead is empty. I don't have to convince you of that. You know that already. You see it. Everything you do is trying to fill a hole that you just cannot fill. And I think one of the things the book of Ecclesiastes does that I like has been especially important to me, and that almost always people that I study with, even if I only study with them 2 or 3 times, like, they know, like, oh no, yeah, this is absolutely true, is you keep living out in the world, you'll never actually be satisfied. You might be happy. We're not talking about like you won't be happy at all. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, Solomon says, I do all the things I want to do, and my heart was happy, but what I wasn't was satisfied. And one of the things I think the book does is it creates a hunger for something deeper. And it shows you, hey, this world was never going to be able to fill you up. And so, like, one of the things, there's a few things that, like, I talk to people about. I'm like, life under the sun without God is like you're running on a treadmill. And you can run 50 miles on a treadmill, but at the end of the day, how far did you get? You're in the same place you started, And that's life without God, because you're born with nothing. And if you could amass everything you want to amass, but eventually you will die and you will have nothing again. But what God offers you is something that surpasses everything here. And so it's one of those books that I think as you talk to people and you study with people, you help them see the hunger that they already have. It's like the person that tells you, hey, I'm kind of hungry. And you had like maybe a latent hunger that you didn't realize till somebody said they were hungry. And now you're like, wait, I'm kind of hungry too. I think the book does that for people's souls. And so I love the book for that reason. But that's usually where I go with people.
That's such a great way of putting it. I've never thought of that analogy where, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Someone mentions they're hungry and all of a sudden my appetite stirred up. But yeah, that's such an interesting idea in general, like about humanity, how it's almost like everybody's that one thought away from that deep search for God.
And I think a lot of people suppress that. Like I think everybody has those thoughts, and you have those. It's the reason why in my mind is the reason why, especially today, we're on our phones as often as we are. We binge watch TV as often as we do. Yeah. Exactly, or we listen to music all the time, as we don't want to be alone with our thoughts. Because our thoughts are like, you're not actually satisfied. And again, people know that. And so they constantly distract themselves from the reality.
Yeah. And that I think fits the analogy that is working throughout Ecclesiastes of Hevel, that the wind or the breath or the vapor, however you want to put it. Yeah. But it's like that fog that's in the way, that is also like elusive, right? When you reach out and grasp it, it slips through your fingertips. And I think a lot of times it's translated meaningless, which I think that's good, but there's something about the image of a vapor that I think Solomon or whoever was the primary like compiler of it all, really wants to get across, that it so many things in life just create a fog from seeing the greater reality.
And it's a grasping after the wind.
Yeah.
And which really, if you're driving and you're driving down the road and you stick your hand out, you can feel wind. Like I don't think Solomon's point is none of this is real.
Yeah.
It's just you can't hold on to any of it.
Yeah.
You know, there's some like feeling to it, but there's no real substance to it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he talks about, God's put eternity in man's heart. So it's like we have this feeling in our hearts, but we're grasping at the wind to try to satisfy that thing in our heart. And that's I really like that. I've heard people use that as kind of the first place to go with unbelievers, and that makes a lot of sense. So, but let's like get back to your story. We kind of got ahead of ourselves there, but so you're 16 at this point. You become a Christian. You're going on a cross country tour of meeting Christian families, and that's such an awesome experience. I'm sure there's so many stories you could tell from all that time. But what was just the rest of high school like, and then into college? Like, how did the Lord work in your life during that time?
So the rest of high school was rough, and that was self-inflicted. And but even in that, I think the Lord had some really good people in my life, watching over me. A lot of calls, a lot of let's go do these things, let's go do those things. But I think again, when you have the home life that's rough, and then like you're playing on a sports team. I mentioned this to some of the kids yesterday. We were talking about this. We were talking about like setting yourself apart. And personally, I think like when I finished high school, it was like one of the best things that happened to me, because it was like, all right, you can reinvent yourself all the way through. The high school I went to was like middle school through high school. And so all those kids, they knew me since I was in the 6th grade. Now I'm a junior in high school. And so it's sometimes hard to distance yourself and separate yourself from those things. And that, just full transparency, I wasn't always the person I was supposed to be, and I didn't always behave in the ways in which I was supposed to behave. And I look at that time in some ways with guilt, but Keith was mentioning today, but like guilt in a good way, in that I hated how I behaved, and it's a reminder, hey, I know God has forgiven me of that. Don't put yourself in that situation ever again. But college was actually great because I didn't go to FC. I went to a small little engineering school up in New York, but I was like, all right, I don't know anybody here. You can be anybody. Who are you going to choose to be? I don't care about what, it really wasn't even like so much what am I going to do? I knew I was going to study math, but like who am I going to be? Because now I have a choice. Really, I had a choice all along, but you really get to start fresh. And so I was like, all right, I'm really going to try to live my life for Jesus Christ. And so I was incredibly intentional about that. The people that I spent time with, I remember telling myself, like, I was like, any free time that I have, I will spend time with Christians. Doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, none of that matters. I'm just going to spend time with Christians. And then I worked a job. So I went to school, worked a job, and was a part of, helped out with 2 different churches. And it was just those experiences that was like, all right, here's it. And I was like, I proactively sought out mentors to reach out to and talk to and things like that. And so really when I was 18, 19, it was like the big shift in my life, where I'm like, all right, this is if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. We're not going to do this half-heartedly,
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that part of the story, just because I remember making that kind of conscious decision after, I wasn't planning on going to FC. I was planning on going to an engineering school.
I'm not knocking you for it, Jared. It's okay.
I was planning on going to a Texas A&M, an engineering school. And I was like all in. That was huge where I'm, Houston, where I'm from. And even before I was planning to go to FC, I was so looking forward to a kind of reset. Not because I had a great home, great church, and it's not like I was just running around acting crazy or anything, but there was a level of dedication that I was lacking in that I knew once I made that shift, I wanted to be just absolutely all in, everything I had. And so that was kind of my switch too. But kind of backing up to those high school years, what was it that kept you on track? One, you said you had this the way you described it, I would say a healthy hatred for your sin. Like
Yeah.
you saw your sin for what it was and you hated it, and it was a healthy guilt that was that vehicle that led you to the throne of grace. But outside of that, what kind of like kept you on board at that point? Because that sounds like such a vulnerable moment when Satan could have like snatched you away. Like, so what kept you on track during that?
And that's where I think back and I think about God's grace, like just God's providence and His grace throughout all of that. Because there should have been so many opportunities and so many moments when I just stopped, you know. But one of the things I remember at the beginning that I told myself was like, so, you know, I was like, all right, if I'm going to be doing this and I know my family is going to be against this, I committed myself. This is one thing that in spite, I was like, doesn't matter how I'm living, I will be at church. And whenever Christians are together, I will be there. Mm-hmm. And so every Sunday, didn't matter. Again, my parents weren't, they weren't waking me up to go to church. I had to get up, set my own alarm, you know, get up and get dressed and go.
Yeah. And then is that still where Roger Polanco was at that point? Or?
That's a bilingual church with Roger and Gardner and Caleb Churchill helped and Tim Bunting. But that started my freshman year of college. So that, again, the big shift. And so I was able to help there.
That makes sense.
But there was a Spanish-speaking church a little bit further up north. And I even say this, the bilingual church that we kind of got started there my freshman year of college, met in the basement of the building that I grew up in. And so it was like the church is, exactly. It would be like if we're in this building, if like I lived in where y'all have Bible classes upstairs.
That's pretty
And so
crazy.
it was like the church is literally in my basement. And so it even helped play a role for me. I was like, okay, dude, we're right here. Think about all the impact that you can have and people, you know. And so it was great. It was absolutely great. But no, at the time, the church was like in Upper Manhattan, so it's maybe 3 miles north. But via train ride, it's like a 40-minute distance to get there. But that's where I used to go prior to that. But they used to have Bible classes every Tuesday night, Thursday night, and then Sunday. And so worship Sunday, and on Sundays it would be like Roger would go to 3 different churches. So he'd start at Sherman, we'd go to Jersey to a church Passaic, go to a Bible class in Fairlawn, and then Sunday night go to Washington. I see y'all have Bill and Judy Dolan here, or I don't know if they worship here or not. I saw them this morning, but they were like, I remember they were the first people that like had me over for dinner at their house in Jersey, and you know, but it was so great because it was like I wouldn't have had that opportunity otherwise. But I committed myself to I'm going to these things, which by the way sometimes meant that for me like there were some homework assignments that, you know, got turned in a little late. Like my parents weren't always super happy about that, but I tried to do what I could to make sure that I was like fulfilling the obligations I had as a son, but at the same time making sure that I was not like, again, to me it was like, if Christians are together, I'm just gonna be there. Doesn't matter. Yeah. You're doing a special thing on a Wednesday night. All right, I'll try to be there. You know, it's like that. Yeah. That was because it was like I have to be here, because if not, like every other time, everything else, I'm inundated with non-Christians.
Yeah.
And so I have to spend some time with Christians.
Wow, that definitely I think changes people's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I imagine this would be something like preaching to the choir. Right?
Sure.
Like a lot of people who would listen to this kind of content are probably the kind of people who are always going to want to go and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
But it definitely, even just for me, like I kind of have to be here, you know, like I want to be, but it changes my perspective because it's so easy as somebody who like grew up with this all my life, and there was never an expectation that I wouldn't be here, and it's so ingrained into my conscience to where honestly, like aside from even serving the Lord, I would just feel guilty for inexplicable reasons because it's so ingrained in my practice and everything. But that really puts it in a different light, because you're describing what David said when he's like one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek. To seek you in your temple, to gaze upon your beauty. Like this is all that I desire, to be in your presence. That's often mediated through communing with other saints.
Yeah.
And that kind of hunger and desire to be with God's people, to open up his word and experience his presence through all of that. It's certainly motivating. And you know, something that I think is a really helpful reminder. So through all that, you're, it sounds like there's this just level of dedication and commitment, because you see the life of Jesus lived out through other Christians, and and you see that this is a better path of life to go down, and that becomes more and more and more real to you. And then you get into college, there's that extra like turning point, even greater level of commitment, and now you're getting involved in sort of the teaching aspect of it. What was that part like?
Yeah, so it ended up being, so the shift ended up being like, it wasn't even just, because there was a point where like at first it was like, I'm dedicated to being here.
Okay.
And then it really was a little bit later on. It's like, no, I'm going to be dedicated to being a part of this. I'm not just going to be here. I'm not just going to be a warm body in a pew, but I want to be a part of whatever is going on here. And so, again, so there was that. There ended up actually, it was a split that happened, an unfortunate split. But split even is a strong word, or is a too light a word. There was a little bit of a kicking out that happened, which, again, God's providence, in my opinion, and God's grace, ended up starting that bilingual work. And so I was a member there, but that the group that had unfortunately done kind of the kicking out, well, they lost all their Bible class teachers. Like they lost Gardner, lost Roger, lost Tim, lost Caleb Churchill. Like all the guys that would teach were gone now. And so they had no help. And but it was them. They essentially, it was over some language stuff, and it, like Spanish, English stuff, not like inappropriate language, just in case you're thinking Gardner was saying bad words. But I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, like, I'm not sure if this is like, it's an attitude thing. It's not a scripture thing. And so I could still have fellowship with them. And so I would go up. So this is, again, my freshman year of college. I would go up, and on Thursdays, I would teach their Bible class, and every other Thursday, help out. And then on Sundays, and this Gardner would help go on Sundays. So Sundays, Gardner would teach Bible class, and then he and I would split the preaching. And I'm like, I've gone like from very little Bible class teaching to like now I'm teaching every Tuesday night, you know? So I'm like going to school, working, I had a part-time job, and then taking the train up for an hour and some change to go teach a Bible class. Then Wednesday night, West Harlem. Then Thursday, back at Sherman. And then Sunday, I was like preaching some at Sherman. And there was, you know, some times where like, you think about like, I'd be sitting there and, you know, it's Lord's Supper. Somebody taps me on the shoulder. This happened more than one time. And the brother was like, hey, the guy who was supposed to preach isn't here. You have the sermon today. And so could you imagine? You're like, all right, I got 10 minutes to figure out, you know, and they suffered through so much with me, and they were so patient with me. But that played, like, responsibility played a huge role in my growth. And I think being given things to do, maybe even, I would even say, like, in some ways I almost look back and it's like maybe even too young, but being given responsibilities played a huge role for me, because then I was like, okay, this is, again, I'm owning this as well now. Like, this is a part of who I am, and not just a part of what I'm doing and dedicating to being at this place. And some things happened at that Spanish church, unfortunately, where I had to, Gardner and I, we kind of had to like peel out of that. But Ida, this is just, again, God's providence. I had no idea why she asked of this, you know, why the Lord had this in mind to use her in this way. But so now I was free Tuesdays and Thursday nights. And so she came to me one time and she's like, every Friday night, you're going to come and teach a Bible study at my apartment. I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, you're going to teach a Bible study every Friday night at 7:30 in my apartment. I was like, which, by the way, if you're going to go teach a Bible study at a lady's house at 7:30 on Friday nights, it takes you away from potentially, you know, being in places you shouldn't be, because you're teaching the Bible now. And even after you're done, you're like, I should probably go home and, you know, maybe watch a basketball game or whatever. But like,
do you think she was very intentional about that?
And if she wasn't, I believe it's the Lord. I believe it was the Lord working through her, honestly. And then it was like, all right, this is great. I also want you to teach a Tuesday night class in my house. And so it was every Tuesday, every Friday night, I was in her apartment. Every Wednesday we had Bible class. Sunday we worshiped. And the guys there did a really good job. I think at like, you know, it was like there are still no elders or deacons, but like I was like the unofficial deacon. Like I did the duty roster. I helped clean the building. I got stuff ready. But they gave me, though I wasn't doing public teaching, I was privately having studies in people's homes. I was studying with some friends. I was studying with anyone who wanted to study. And one of the things I really appreciated that I think helped, again, my mentality was like at a church like West Harlem. So they meet once on Sunday, and they had 4 evangelists. So how many preaching opportunities? You know, you're preaching they were preaching once a month. And it's like, well, how do you fill your time then? Well, you just study with people and you just go serve people. And that sort of mentality, I think, got ingrained in me, where it's like, okay, I didn't view it as, you know, being a Christian as you know, the real spiritual guys are behind a pulpit. It's like, no, you just go and you do. You study with people, whether people know, they don't know, you go and you help people. and they encouraged me to do that. Like, you don't have to do public things. Nobody cares about that. Go and serve people, and that was helpful for me, just to see it in them, to be encouraged by them, and then for people to entrust me with opportunities to do that for them. Because, like, letting people serve you is you're entrusting them to do this thing for you. And so I'm thankful for all those people as well.
Yeah. So how did that lead into you deciding to commit to that full time? You were a math major,
had zero desire to do it.
Yeah. How did that end up?
So I was like, not that zero desire, like I thought preaching was this shameful thing, but my thought process was always, I just want to be a really good Christian, a servant in the Northeast. And now I've been in the South. I've been preaching almost 10 years now. But no, so the summer before my senior year, I went to Ecuador for 3 weeks to go. I met it. There was I'm trying to spare some details here, but there was a guy who I knew who lived in Arkansas who was helping support a man out of his own pockets. Really neat, actually, helping support a man who was preaching in Ecuador, and he wanted to go and encourage. And so he asked me if I would go with him, and so I was like, sure. I don't know. I'm just like, I guess I would. I was 20 or 21. It's 2013. So I was 20. So I just went down to Ecuador for 3+ weeks. And the first week, that guy wasn't even there. And this is kind of what played a role into me preaching full time. So at this time, I'm living in New York. I'm probably having 10, 15 studies a week, going to school. I had quit my job because I thought, I don't need the money from this job. I was on a scholarship. I lived home alone, but my family owned the apartment, so it was cheap. But I was like, I'm just going to try to teach as much as I can. I had no thought of I'm going to preach full time. It's just like, this is just what I want to do with my free time. And so, but before I went to Ecuador, the evangelist there reached out to me and was like, hey, my son's computer broke. And I was like, okay, I don't know what you want me to do about that. And he's like, well, can you bring him one? I was like, no, I'm a broke college student. I can't help you with that. And he's like, but you live in New York. Can you just ask one of the Christians to chip in for a computer? And I was like, no, this church is mostly compiled of broke college students and widows, so we can't buy your son a computer, And then he kind of just ghosted me for a few days. And it was like a week before the trip, not hearing anything. It's radio silence from him. And so Ben and Caleb had just come back from Africa. So I reached out to Ben Hall. Ben Hall. Ben Hall had just come back from Africa. So I reached out to Ben, and I was like, hey, so this is like, I know you have probably dealt with this. What do you do in this situation? Like, how do you deal with this? What goes on? Because, like, I don't know what to do. And I was like, do I even go down? Do I take the trip? It's like, he hasn't responded. And so we had a really good conversation. It was really encouraging. The trip ended up being great. Not like the first few days withstanding, because the guy, like, I flew in, the guy wasn't even there. Just didn't show up at the hotel. It was really those first few days were really discouraging. But then the guy that I had met in Arkansas, really good guy, once he got there, it was like, it was so much better, and the trip was great and all of those things. But those first few days were tough. But in that conversation with Ben, he was David Maxon, who was working with them, had moved, and so he was like, hey, so what are your plans after you're done with school? And I was like, well, I had a job opportunity to stay in the city, and there had been like a few churches that up north that asked about like maybe like, hey, can you come and help us for a year? But so then he's like, look, we need help down here, and there's a lot of work to be done, and you could put yourself in an environment where you could grow because you're learning from people. It wasn't an official internship or training program, but it was like, you will be with Sue Hall, you'll be with Marty Broadwell, you'll be with these elders. So you're gonna grow just by the fact that you are with these men, but also you could help. And so it all came together like super fast. It was, Ben and I, because the trip was in August, so he and I talked in August. And by like late December, they had agreed to have me come. And then I moved in the beginning of late February. So It happened so fast. And again, it wasn't in my plans. I just wanted to stay in the city. I wanted to be a math teacher. Like that was my dream. I wanted to be a math professor, but like that was the dream for me, Yeah. And God had different things in mind. And I thank him for it.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So you mentioned a lot of names there once you got down to Embry Hills who were, I know you've shared before how impactful some of those key mentors were, and I know some of them just like kind of by extension, but
sure.
I'm curious, just briefly, like what what was that like when you got there? And then what I would really like to hear is just how has all of this experience of where God has led you throughout your life impacted the way that you serve people today, but then especially like maybe even recently some of the people that you see are drawing closer and closer to the Lord through relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, maybe to answer your first question, I think, whenever I first got there, people joke there's like a running joke, not just at Embry Hills, but in other places where we have 15 evangelists.
Yeah,
now it's really just Philip and I that preach full time, but we do have, so Philip and I preach, but we also have 3 other elders who preach. One of our elders, Dave Hamlet, used to preach full time in Canada and moved down for his family. And I think like Dave is one of the biggest influences in my life, Dave Hamlet. But we have deacons we have elders that preach. We have deacons that can have done training programs in other places and can preach, and and so it's so many guys that fill so many roles. And then we have Marty Broadwell, who to me personally is like cream of the crop. He won't hear this, so it's fine, and he would hate any sort of praise, but like to me is like the most brilliant Bible orator I've ever heard speak. And I'll be honest, at first it was like a hard lesson to learn. So I'm like with all these guys, and then I'm with Ben as well, Hall. And then the following year, Philip Shoemate comes, and like you feel like, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing. Every time I get up there, I'm saying something dumb. Like it's the feeling. Like but what it did was it did a few things. One, it helped me realize I'm not preaching to them. I'm preaching to souls, everybody. And so it helps you kind of get past yourself, get past the comparison, get past all of that. I will never be Sewell Hall. And I love him to bits. One of my kids is named after him. He's grandfather. He's pap to our family. But I'll never be so. And that's okay. But I've been impacted by him, and I've learned so much from him. And that's one of the things I think that, like, being at a church like Embry Hills, there's so many people. And not just the men, by the way. There's some women there. We have a lady, Janice Heyman, who I think knows more Bible than anybody I've ever met. Like, absolutely brilliant, And there's like so many people that just have done so much good and have been so helpful to me and to our family. I was 21 when I moved there. I was wet behind the ears, And so now I'm 31. I've got kids, married, I was 21 and single, And so but it's just different now, the situation. But in a lot of ways, like they helped grow me up. They grew me up, if you get what I'm saying. And so I'm so thankful for them. And in a lot of ways, it's almost like, and funnily enough, like they also supported Roger when Roger first started to preach. So he's teaching me the gospel. And so like, Embry Hills has supported me in ways that they haven't even realized. And I think that's really neat. You think about maybe a church like Lost River here, where like they're making investments, not just in you and Lawrence to do this full time, but in men in other places. And they don't know who those men are teaching, who might even potentially help them out in the future. But again, God works in mysterious ways, but his ways are always good.
Yeah. Well, I can definitely relate to the whole growing up thing. I still have a lot of that to do, but coming in here right after FC, like about almost exactly the same age, and having that same experience of like, oh man, I've no clue what I'm doing. And there's so many people here who are so qualified and who I would prefer to just sit at their feet and listen.
Absolutely.
But there's something that's so healthy about that, and that feeds your soul in such a powerful way. So I'm really grateful for that. And again, like you said, not just the men, but the women too, right? Mothers and fathers in the faith, brothers and sisters, grandfathers and grandmothers. There's a reason it's called the family of God. So what about is in terms of just some of the work that God has done just through you sharing the gospel with other people? I know your family has been impacted by that in a beautiful way. I know you've mentioned a few stories, and I know you could probably talk about dozens of people who've come to Christ. And but what would you share in terms of that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give 2 stories. Yeah, and I again, one is a family story, and then one is a story that happened very recently. But again, so I obey the gospel, and I'm the only Christian in my family for years, and over a decade. And it's gut wrenching. Like, if anyone is listening to this and you have family that aren't Christians, or you're the only Christian in your family, it is. I personally understand the weight that you are bearing. It's hard, because you come here and you sing songs about heaven, but in the back of your mind, you're like, but my parents won't be there, or my siblings won't be there, and it's hard to live with that. And I think about what Paul says in Romans chapters 9 and 10 and 11, where he said, if I could be accursed so that my countrymen can come to the Lord. Like, you just see the weight that Paul is bearing with all of that. And I think sometimes it's easy to just think, well, just resign yourself to it. They're never going to come to the Lord. And a few years ago, so during COVID, in fact, everything gets shut down. So I reached out to 4 of my sisters, and I'm like, hey, do y'all want to just study on Zoom? And so we studied Ecclesiastes, and then we went through the Gospel of Mark, and like after that, like a few of my sisters it tapered off. But one of my older sisters, Vanessa, 7 years older than me, she kept studying with me. She started studying with Roger, started studying with Tim Bunting, and like made some steps to show repentance. Particularly, she was in a relation. I'll say this maybe as well. She was living with her boyfriend, had been living with her boyfriend for 10 years, and she knew she couldn't like be a Christian and just live with her boyfriend. And so she had a conversation with him. He's a decent man for what it's worth, and like they got married just so she can come to the Lord. Like that's, to me, like that's a step that someone would take when they want to, because like they've been together for 10 years. People in the world, why get married? Who cares at that point? But to me, like for her, like that was a step that she wanted to take. And like, again, I'd been at that point a Christian 14 years. And here's somebody who finally comes to the Lord. And now we've had our other opportunities with other people in our family. But again, don't give up is what I'm saying. Keep shining a light for us. And I think for me especially, what really helped was Heather. And so her seeing my marriage with Heather, her seeing our kids, and us being, and because she's in a relationship, she has children, and they see that, and they see the difference. Kind of what I saw years ago, they're now seeing, and so, and they're seeing it in us. And so God working in all those ways was absolutely great. Wow. And then another story maybe the last story I want to just kind of give, again, to just think about the gospel, and if you've listened up to this point, like if you're going to have any takeaways, that the gospel can reach anyone, the people, those kids that are annoying, those kids that are trouble. I was that kid, those kids or those people that you think this person is never going to change. I'm sure I was that at different points in my life, that people might have been tempted to think that. And the gospel can change anyone. Like God's grace can reach even me, And so there's a lady, we do at Embry Hills, we do a Bible giveaway where we get some Bibles and then we just go out in the streets, and we have a semi-busy road where we're at, and we just hand out Bibles. One of our members, we have like 40, 50 members that come out and participate in this on a Saturday morning. One of our members, his name is Oscar, he has a Bible. There's a lady who's at a light, and he knocks on the window and hands her a Bible. And they kind of start talking, and then she starts to read. He reads to her a verse, and they chat a little bit, and she says, well, I'll come and worship with you guys. That happens. Nothing, sometimes you think nothing will come of that. Well, 2 weeks later, she came and worshiped with us. This was about 6 months ago. A few weeks after that, she's Colombian, so I'm teaching the Spanish class. I'm teaching Exodus. I'm teaching the law of Moses. It's not like, I'm not even teaching like the Exodus story. I'm going through the law when she starts visiting. And she's like, she's just soaking it up. And then after a point, she asked me, hey, can we study just on a weeknight? And so I get a few other sisters who come, and so the 4 of us are meeting together, me, her, and 2 sisters. And after like the second or third study, she says, I have to tell you something. And she's crying. And she says, the Saturday that Oscar handed me the Bible, that I was in my car, I was actually driving to go commit suicide. And like, that's where she was in her life, whenever God worked, because we could have done the Bible giveaway 2 hours later. We could have done it 2 hours earlier. Oscar could have not have knocked on her, on her car window. Like, so many things had to happen. You can call it coincidence, and maybe that's what it is. But so many things, I don't think so. But so many things had to happen, and that worked out in a certain way where I just believe it was God providentially working in her life. And this past week, on Thursday, so the Thursday before I came up here, we're studying Thursday night, and she put on Jesus Christ through the waters of baptism, and I praise God for that. And after she comes up, she's crying, and she's telling me, God saved me twice. He gave me life 2 times. And I just think about that, that the gospel could even reach someone who literally was going to take their life that day. And it's like, this is how incredible God is, how gracious, how merciful the Lord that we serve is. And I've seen it in my life, and I've seen it in the lives of so many other people. Today, I got a text message from Philip that 2 other people obeyed the gospel back home. And it's just like, it's beautiful, And one guy's a guy who just moved up from Mexico with his wife, and his wife's a Christian and he's not. And they've been married a few years, and he comes to the gospel. Another one is one of our high school kids, parents who raising their children well. But again, the gospel is for everyone, and this because God is for everyone. All who would come to Him, He freely gives.
Yeah, a word that you use kind of at the beginning and at the end just now is the word providence. And I can hear in the way that you talk, like you're certainly a big believer in that, and somebody who isn't afraid, I wouldn't say to throw that word around, but to say it, to make use of it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we're afraid to use that word. And look, I get sometimes the fear, and I would even say sometimes I believe maybe potentially an overcorrection on that word. I'm not explicitly saying God did this or God did that. I'm not. I wouldn't want to whittle on God's end of the stick, if you know what I mean. But I think sometimes we can lack gratitude because we fail to see the Lord's work in our lives. We think, well, He just worked in the first century and then He stopped working. Like, yeah, maybe He miraculously stopped working in the first century, but He answers prayers. What would you call that?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's God at work in your life. And
that's so true. And not just in the stories of the woman that you just mentioned or in your own story, but in the story of the other high school kid who was baptized, and the story of whoever else who has been led to the waters. Like God's providence isn't just for particular people. It's like the Lord is at work at all times, in all places, in all situations, and we may not always have the eyes to see it.
Sure.
But we certainly should have the spirit of gratitude to receive it and to bless the Lord for it. And if we have a relationship with God, that is like the definition of providence. That's His work in our lives.
Amen. And maybe I can encourage you, whoever's listening, to just at some point this week, take 15 minutes and look at the last 10 years of your life. And just look at like, okay, how did I get here? And think of all the things that could have gone differently that didn't go that way. Where God, or again, where you could say coincidentally, these things worked out this way. But Jared, you being here right now, us being together at this moment, I believe it's God's work in our lives to accomplish a greater good that maybe we don't see right now, but maybe eventually we might.
Yeah. Reminds me of Isaiah 55, the word will not return empty.
Correct.
Anytime it's open, the Lord's going to accomplish His purpose. So, Bill, thank you so much for the words that you spoke throughout this whole weekend, the words that the Lord spoke through you. And I know that won't return empty. I've seen it already work in the kids and in my own heart, and I know that's going to continue on. But also, thank you for carving out some time for this.
No, thank you for that.
I love just getting to know you more and hanging out with your family for a little bit, and appreciate so much the work that you do and the ways that you've just kind of encouraged me and inspired me along the way, even literally on my way here to Bowling Green when I first moved here, getting to stop off at Embry Hills. But you just poured so much into me in that moment, and I really appreciate that. And thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the work that you and Lawrence are doing here, and I will continue to pray for you guys.